My wife's lawyer. He actually laughed when he saw my $12 Walmart shirt. He stood there, telling the judge I was too poor to even visit my own daughter, while he adjusted his $650 an hour tie. He spent the whole morning mocking my pay stubs from the local auto shop, and honestly, the entire courtroom was looking at me like I was a complete and total failure. But what he didn't realize, what nobody in that room realized, was that while he was performing his masterclass in contempt, 2 Federal Marshals were standing right outside those heavy oak doors, and they were holding a warrant for my wife's arrest. The fluorescent lights in courtroom 4B buzzed, like a swarm of angry wasps trapped in a glass jar. I'd been sitting on that hard wooden bench for 20 minutes, just staring at a small water stain on the ceiling, trying to keep my face like a mask of stone. "Your Honor," Hartwell said, his voice just dripping with that Ivy League arrogance that makes your skin crawl. "I'd like to enter into Evidence Exhibit 14. These are Mr. Dalton's last 3 pay stubs from his current employment." He paused. He started flipping through his leather-bound folder with this exaggerated slowness, just to make the room feel smaller. "Ah, yes. Henderson's Auto Repair, $2,047 per month. Before taxes, of course." He let that number hang in the stale air-conditioned air, like a bad smell. I could feel the heat rising in my neck, but I didn't move a muscle. I just focused on the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. I looked like a man who had given up on life, a guy whose biggest ambition was making it to Friday without stripping a bolt on a Chevy transmission. To provide some context, Your Honor, Hartwell continued pacing the floor in his Italian leather loafers. My client, Jessica Dalton, currently earns $14,500 per month as a senior marketing director at Prestige Communications. Their daughter, Emma, attends Riverside Academy. Annual tuition is $38,000. Mr. Dalton's entire annual income wouldn't even cover half of that. My lawyer, Miguel Santos, shifted uncomfortably beside me. He was a young public defender who'd been assigned to me 3 weeks ago, and honestly, the kid looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. See, he didn't know the truth. Nobody in this room did. To Miguel, I was just another sad divorce case he was destined to lose. To the court, I was a deadbeat who'd fallen off the corporate ladder and hit every single rung on the way down. Your Honor, we aren't asking for anything unreasonable, Hartwell said, sounding like the voice of pure logic. Primary custody to my client, supervised visitation for Mr. Dalton twice a month, and child support calculated at the standard percentage, which, given his modest situation, would be approximately $427 per month. A sharp, jagged snicker echoed from the gallery. I didn't have to turn around to know it was my mother-in-law, Diane. For 9 years, she'd treated me like a charity project, constantly reminding me, at every Thanksgiving and birthday, that her daughter had married down. I could almost feel her eyes boring into the back of my cheap shirt, savoring the moment she finally got to see me erased from her family's perfect life. Mr. Dalton. The voice was sharp. It cut right through Hartwell's posturing. I looked up. Judge Patricia Whitmore was studying me over the rim of her reading glasses. She was in her mid-50s, with silver hair pulled back into a bun so tight it looked painful. She had the kind of face that had seen every lie, every sob story, and every legal trick in the book. "Yes, Your Honor?" I asked. My voice was low and steady, maybe a little too steady, for a man who was supposed to be losing everything. "You've been very quiet during these proceedings," she said, her pen hovering over a legal pad. "Do you have anything to say in response to opposing counsel's characterization of your financial situation?" I glanced at Miguel. He gave me a tiny, desperate nod. "We'd discussed this." "No, Your Honor," I said, leaning back slightly. "Not at this time." Hartwell actually laughed, a genuine, condescending chuckle that rang out in the open court. "Your Honor, I think Mr. Dalton's silence speaks volumes. He knows he can't provide for his daughter. He knows—" "Mr. Hartwell," Judge Whitmore interrupted. Her tone was flat and dangerous. "I didn't ask for your commentary. I asked Mr. Dalton a question, and he answered it." Hartwell shut his mouth so fast, I practically heard his teeth click. He had the grace to look slightly chastised, though that smug glint remained in his eyes. He thought he'd already won. He thought the score was settled. Judge Whitmore shuffled through a stack of papers, the sound of the parchment like dry leaves in the silence. Before we proceed with final arguments, I need to confirm some details for the official record. She looked at me again, her gaze searching for something. Mr. Dalton, please state your full legal name. I took a deep breath. The smell of old floor wax and cheap coffee filled my lungs. This was it. The moment the 3-year mask started to crack. Vincent Thomas Dalton, I said. The name seemed to echo, bouncing off the wood-paneled walls and hanging in the air. I watched Judge Whitmore's pen stop dead in the middle of a word. She didn't move for 3 full seconds. Then, she slowly lifted her head, and I watched the color drain from her face as if someone had pulled a plug. I'm sorry, she said, her voice suddenly fragile. Careful. Could you repeat that name? Vincent Thomas Dalton, Your Honor, I said again, enunciating every single syllable. She stared at me, really looking at me now, seeing past the $12 shirt and the grease-stained cuticles. She turned to her clerk, a young redhead with nervous hands, and whispered something. The clerk's eyes went wide. She stood up so fast her chair screeched against the linoleum, and then she was sprinting toward the door behind the bench. The room shifted. The air felt heavy, electric. Hartwell frowned, his confidence flickering like a dying bulb. Your Honor, is there a problem? Whitmore didn't even look at him. She was still staring at me. But the cool authority was gone. In its place was fear. Raw, unadulterated fear. The side door slammed open. 2 men in dark, tailored suits walked in with the heavy, practiced stride of people who owned whatever room they entered. Federal Marshals. I recognized the gold badges on their belts immediately. They didn't go to the judge. They didn't go to the gallery. They walked straight to the plaintiff's table. Jessica Marie Dalton? The first marshal said. My wife looked up, her expression a mix of confusion and annoyance. Yes? What is this? I'm in the middle of a hearing. The marshal didn't blink. He pulled a folded document from his jacket. Mrs. Dalton, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, theft of government funds, and obstruction of justice. The courtroom turned into a riot of sound. Jessica screamed a primal, jagged sound that tore through the room. What? No! This is insane! I haven't done anything. Hartwell was on his feet, shouting about outrages and legal proceedings, but the second marshal was already behind Jessica. The handcuffs caught the overhead light with a sickening metallic click. This warrant was signed by a federal judge 2 hours ago. Counselor, the marshal said, his voice a low rumble. Your client has the right to remain silent. Anything she says can and will be used against her. Jessica's eyes found mine across the chaos. Her mascara was running, her perfect life dissolving into black streaks on her cheeks. Vincent, what did you do? Vincent, what did you do? I didn't say a word. I just sat there in my clearance rack shirt and watched the woman who'd spent 18 months calling me a failure get dragged out in chains. Everyone in that room thought I was the loser who lost everything in the divorce. They had no idea I wasn't just working at a mechanic shop. I was hiding a digital ticking time bomb that was about to erase Richard Crane's entire empire. My name is Vincent Dalton. 3 years ago, I was a senior investigator for FinCEN, with a 6-figure salary and a clearance that could ruin empires. I walked away from it all to become a mechanic in suburban Virginia. Not because I had to, but because I was hunting. And today, after 1,127 days of playing the fool, the trap finally snapped shut. To understand how I ended up sitting in a courtroom, wearing a clearance rack shirt while my wife was led away in irons, you have to look back at September 21. At the time, I was at the absolute peak of my game. I'd spent 15 years grinding at FinCEN, finally clawing my way up to senior investigator in the complex financial crimes division. My daily reality was a high-stakes chess match, played with spreadsheets and offshore wire transfers. I tracked the invisible ink of global corruption, untangling the spiderwebs of shell companies that monsters use to hide their blood money. I was good at it, obsessively good. By 35, I'd built the cases that put 3 hedge fund managers, a crooked state senator, and a Fortune 500 CFO behind bars for a very long time. Jessica and I had been married for 6 years back then. We met at one of those stuffy, high-end charity galas in D.C., where the wine is expensive and the conversation is hollow. She was doing PR for a nonprofit, looking like a literal movie star in a sea of gray suits. She had this radiant, effortless confidence that made every room she walked into feel 5 sizes smaller. 2 years into the marriage, Emma arrived. The second I held that tiny, screaming human in my arms, I was gone. I sat in that sterile hospital room with tears streaming down my face, looking at this perfect mix of me and the woman I worshipped. I made a silent vow right then. I would protect her from the world, no matter what it took. For the first 4 years of Emma's life, I lived in a beautiful, naive bubble. I thought we were the it couple, the one that actually made it work in a city built on broken promises. I was dead wrong. Looking back, the first domino fell the day Jessica announced she was leaving her nonprofit gig. She'd been headhunted by Prestige Communications, a boutique marketing firm that was offering to nearly triple her salary. "Richard thinks I have executive potential, Vince," she told me over a bottle of overpriced Cabernet. Richard Crane, the CEO, had personally recruited her, promising a fast track to the C-suite. "He wants to mentor me. This is the kind of opportunity that changes everything for our family." I was thrilled for her, genuinely proud to see her getting the recognition I thought she deserved. I didn't notice the rot setting in at first because I was too busy celebrating her rising star status. When the 10 p.m. arrivals became midnight entries, I told myself she was just paying her dues. My own schedule was a chaotic mess of tracking international markets and late-night depositions. So I just assumed we were both grinding. I didn't even blink at the new wardrobe, the designer handbags, and the 4-figure shoes that started cluttering our closet. Honestly, she'd always liked the finer things, and now that she was pulling in $14,500 a month, I figured she was just enjoying the fruits of her labor. But then, the silence started. We stopped dissecting our days over dinner. Eventually, we stopped having dinner altogether. The laughter in our house was replaced by the low hum of her phone, vibrating with urgent work texts at 2 in the morning. Emma became the only thing holding the roof up. We started orbiting our daughter like 2 dying planets that had forgotten they were supposed to share the same sun. Whenever I tried to bridge the gap, Jessica would shut me down with a cold, practiced efficiency. "You're imagining things, Vince. I'm just stressed. Not everyone has a government job where they can just coast." The gaslighting was subtle at first. Then it became a weapon. Every time I questioned a late night or a weekend retreat, I was being controlling. Every concern I voiced was labeled as paranoia or professional jealousy. The fights escalated from quiet bickering to full-blown psychological warfare, leaving me feeling like I was losing my mind in my own home. Everything changed on a gray Tuesday in October. I was supposed to be at a conference in New York, but a freak storm grounded all flights out of LaGuardia. I managed to snag a seat on an earlier train back to D.C., thinking I'd surprise Jessica and maybe we could finally have a real conversation. I walked into our master bedroom, and I found her with Richard Crane. The sheer cliché of it was what hit me first, the classic husband comes home early nightmare. There was the frantic scramble for covers, the discarded silk dress on the floor, and the man himself. Richard Crane was exactly what you'd expect. Smooth, silver-haired, and reeking of a cologne that probably cost more than my first car. He was buttoning his custom-tailored shirt with a terrifying amount of composure. "Vince, wait. This isn't what you think," Jessica stammered, her face a mask of panicked guilt. I stood in the doorway, my hands trembling as I gripped my suitcase handle. "It's exactly what I think, Jessica." Richard Crane actually had the audacity to step forward, holding his hands up like he was dealing with a stray dog. "Vincent, let's all just take a breath. These things happen. We're adults. We can discuss this rationally. I stared at him, and for the first time in my life, I used my professional training on my own reality. I looked at his micro-expressions, the slight curl of his lip, the way he didn't even look ashamed. He looked bored. He had the absolute, unshakable arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. "Get out of my house," I said, my voice coming out as a low, dangerous growl. "Now, Richard, before I throw you out of the window." He left without another word, pausing only to check his reflection in our hallway mirror. Jessica followed him to the door, whispering something frantic that I couldn't catch over the pounding of my own heart. When she walked back into the room, the guilt had already evaporated. It was replaced by something cold, sharp, and calculated, the look of a woman who had already moved on to the next play. "I want a divorce," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. "Fine," I replied. She blinked, clearly thrown by how fast I'd folded. She wanted a fight. She wanted me to beg so she could use my desperation as leverage. "Fine? That's it? You're not even going to fight for us?" I looked at her, really seeing the stranger she'd become. "You've been sleeping with your boss, Jessica. Our marriage is a corpse." She didn't flinch. Instead, her eyes narrowed, revealing a coldness I hadn't known she possessed. "I want the house," she snapped, "and I want primary custody of Emma. You need to understand that Richard has very good lawyers, Vince. The kind you can't afford on a civil servant's salary." She was already posturing, already trying to bury me. "I'm sure he does," I said quietly, my mind suddenly shifting into a gear I hadn't used in years. I thought about Emma, and I thought about the smug, untouchable look on Richard Crane's face. Something clicked deep in my investigator's brain, a pattern, a scent of something much darker than a simple affair. I realized that if I fought her now, I'd lose everything. I needed to see the whole board. "You're not going to fight me on this?" she asked, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. I looked at the wedding photo on the nightstand, a relic from a life that had been a lie. "No," I said, the lie tasting like copper in my mouth. "I'm not going to fight you. Not yet, anyway." That night, the house felt like a tomb. Jessica had packed a bag with enough silk and designer labels to clothe a small village and headed for a friend's place, which I knew was code for Richard's glass-walled penthouse overlooking the Potomac. I sat in my home office, the only room that still smelled like me. Old leather, stale coffee, high-end ink. I cracked open my laptop. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of the cooling fan and the frantic thudding in my chest. Prestige Communications had always been a nagging itch at the back of my brain. It was a boutique firm with 40 employees, but it somehow moved through the world with the gravitational pull of a Fortune 500 company. They landed massive contracts with defense contractors and pharmaceutical giants that usually went to the big box agencies in Manhattan. Honestly, it didn't add up. Richard Crane lived like a Bond villain on a salary that, on paper, shouldn't have covered the fuel for his private jet. I spent the first 2 hours falling down a rabbit hole of public filings and buried tax records. I found the first irregularity at 2 in the morning, a series of consulting fees paid to a Delaware shell company that existed only as a P.O. box. By the time the sun started graying the edges of the blinds, my stomach was in knots. It took me 2 weeks of digital dumpster diving to realize the sheer, terrifying scope of the operation. Richard Crane wasn't a marketing genius. He was the head of a massive money laundering machine. And my wife? She was the one signing the ledgers. The special investigator part of my brain was screaming at me to call the office. Protocol was clear: document, report, and let the Bureau handle the fallout. But I knew exactly how that movie ended in D.C. Richard had deep roots in the kind of soil that doesn't get turned over. He had friends in high places who could make a file vanish into a shredder before the ink was even dry. I'd seen good agents get reassigned to the middle of nowhere for asking the wrong questions about the right people. If I moved too fast through official channels, I was essentially lighting a signal flare for Richard to see me coming. He'd burn the evidence, scrub the servers, and I'd be left standing there with a pink slip and no daughter. Worse, Emma was in that house. If Richard felt the walls closing in, my little girl would be the one caught in the crossfire of his exit strategy. I couldn't risk her life on a system that was prone to leaking like a sieve. That's when I found a single invoice signed by Jessica that changed everything. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was proof that she had put our daughter in a level of danger I couldn't even describe to a jury. She had authorized a payment to a known facilitator for Eastern European cartels. People who didn't just sue you when things went wrong, they erased families. I reached out to the only man in the city whose soul wasn't for sale, Harold Chen. Harold was my mentor, a 63-year-old FinCEN legend who looked like a mild-mannered accountant but had the backbone of a structural steel beam. We met at a Greasy Spoon diner in Arlington, where the air was thick with the smell of burnt bacon and floor cleaner. We sat in a corner booth, the cracked vinyl sticking to my trousers. As I laid out the digital breadcrumbs I'd gathered, "You're sure about this, Vince?" Harold asked. His voice was low as he stirred a cup of tea that looked like battery acid. I leaned in, my voice barely a whisper. "I've traced $47 million through Prestige in the last 18 months alone. It's a classic wash Delaware shells, Cayman accounts, and fake invoices for services that don't exist." Harold's eyes narrowed as he looked at the printouts. "And your wife?" I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my gut, a physical reaction to the betrayal I was finally admitting out loud. "She's authorizing the payments, Harold. She's the gatekeeper." I didn't want to believe she knew, but the signatures were right there in black and white. Maybe she told herself it was just aggressive accounting. Or maybe she just liked the bags too much to care where the money came from. The silence that followed was deafening. Harold finally put down his spoon and looked me straight in the eye. "You need to step back. You're so deep in the conflict of interest that you can't even see the shore." I shook my head, my hands gripping the edge of the laminate table. "I know. If they find out I'm digging into my own family, they'll strip my clearance and bury me. That's why I'm not asking for an official investigation. I'm asking for a ghost protocol." I told him I wanted to disappear to resign, to let the divorce be the official reason for my mental collapse. I wanted the world to see a man who had been broken by a cheating wife and a rich rival. "If I'm still an agent, Richard's people will track my every move," I explained, "but nobody watches a loser. If I'm just some burnout fixing cars, I'm invisible. And while I'm invisible, I can build a case so airtight that not even the president's lawyers could find a leak." Harold looked at me like I was insane. And honestly, maybe I was. "You're talking about years of your life, Vince. Years of watching that man raise your daughter while you live in the dirt." My jaw was so tight it ached. "I'll lose her temporarily to save her permanently. The truth is, the only thing that gets us both out of this alive. I was gambling my entire existence on a long-shot play. But for Emma, I'd bet against the house every single time." 2 weeks later, I walked into the office and handed in my badge. I cited personal stress and marital collapse as the reason for my resignation. And within an hour, my 15-year career was a closed file. 3 months after that, the transformation was complete. I was working at Henderson's Auto Repair, pulling in $17 an hour, and smelling like motor oil and cheap cigarettes. My new home was a 1-bedroom apartment that smelled like mildew and disappointment. Every morning, I woke up with grease under my fingernails and the taste of betrayal in my mouth. My coworkers at the shop were good guys. They saw my divorced dad routine and took pity on me, buying me rounds at the local dive bar and telling me things would look up. They didn't know that every night, after the shop lights went down, I was back in my war room apartment, navigating encrypted drives and burner phones. The deeper I went, the more I realized that prestige was just a shiny hood ornament on a much larger vehicle of corruption. Richard Crane was the primary launderer for a global network that would make a cartel boss blush. He was moving blood money for Mexican drug lords, Eastern European arms dealers, and politicians on 3 continents who needed their kickbacks cleaned. I spent 2.5 years thread mining this criminal tapestry. Working off the books with Data Herald managed to slip me under the radar. It was a grind that aged me a decade in 30 months. By the time I had the full picture, Richard Crane didn't look like a successful executive anymore. He looked like the center of a black hole, and I was the only one close enough to pull the plug without getting sucked in. As I peeled back the layers of prestige communications, the image of Jessica I'd held in my head for a decade began to dissolve like salt in the rain. She wasn't just some clueless executive assistant caught in the wrong lane. She was the architect of the traffic flow. My nights were spent staring at high-resolution scans of fake invoices she'd drafted her elegant cursive authorizing wire transfers to offshore accounts in the Caymans. Whether she'd started as a dupe or a shark, it didn't matter anymore. By the time I had the full picture, she was so deep in the criminal sludge that ignorance would have been a laughable defense. The investigation was a walk in the park compared to the weekends with Emma. Per our temporary agreement, I only got 2 days every other week, and Jessica made sure those 48 hours felt like a prison sentence. She'd spent months poisoning the well, telling the court-appointed mediator that I was an unstable influence because I smelled like motor oil and lived in a place where the elevator usually didn't work. I had to sit there, jaw clenched, while she played the victim in her designer silk blouses. "He works at a car repair shop. For heaven's sake," I heard her whisper shout to the mediator in the hallway. "He lives in a studio apartment with a view of a dumpster." What kind of example is that for our daughter? I just looked at the scuffs on my boots and said nothing. I couldn't afford to reveal my hand or show I had a single dime of my FinCEN back pay tucked away to save Emma. I had to look like a man who had completely run out of options. Emma's confusion was the hardest pill to swallow. She'd look around my cramped apartment, her eyes lingering on the peeling wallpaper and the one-burner stove. "Are you poor now, Daddy?" she asked one Sunday afternoon, her voice small and heartbreaking. I knelt down, ignoring the ache in my knees, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I have everything I need, sweetheart," I told her, my heart feeling like it was being put through a paper shredder. "I have you." Then came the knife in the back. "Richard says you gave up," she whispered, looking at her shoes. "He says you couldn't handle the pressure of a real job." The audacity of that silver-haired parasite made my vision go blurry with rage. I wanted to scream the truth, to tell her that I was the one holding the sword over his head. But I just pulled her into a hug instead. "People say a lot of things, baby. One day you'll understand why Daddy made these choices. I promise." By the arrival of 2024, the trap was fully loaded. I had documented 12 distinct shell companies and a staggering $127 million in illegal transactions. I had bank records, encrypted emails, and recorded conversations that were going to make Richard's expensive legal team look like a group of circus clowns. But the timing was a nightmare. If I dropped the hammer too early, Jessica would be hauled off in cuffs, and Emma would end up with her grandmother Diane, a woman who viewed me as a biological error or worse, the foster system. I needed a controlled detonation. I needed to be the one standing there to catch Emma when the world exploded. That's when Jessica, in her infinite arrogance, handed me the golden ticket. She filed a motion to reduce my visitation to once a month, supervised only, citing my failure to maintain appropriate living standards. The reality was transparent. Richard wanted to adopt her. They wanted to erase my name from her birth certificate like it was a typo in a marketing brief. "We have to fight this, Vince," Miguel Santos said, waving the legal papers in my face. Miguel was a green-as-grass public defender, probably still paying off his student loans, and definitely convinced I was a lost cause. "If we don't respond, she wins by default. You'll lose her forever." I leaned back in the plastic chair of the legal aid office. The smell of old paper and desperation thick in the air. "Don't respond," I said, calmly. Miguel looked at me like I'd just admitted to eating lead paint. "What? Are you hearing me? She's going to take your daughter." I put a steady hand on his shoulder, feeling the nervous twitch in his frame. "Let her think she's winning. Let her file for a full custody hearing on June 17th. I needed her in a specific courtroom. in front of a specific judge, on a day when the FBI wouldn't be busy with other raids. The first piece of the endgame was Harold Chen. We met at our usual greasy spoon, the tabletop sticky with maple syrup. I slid an encrypted hard drive across the laminate surface. 3 years of work, Harold. Every name, every dollar, every fake invoice signed by my wife. Harold's hand trembled slightly as he took it. You know there's no turning back once I hand this to the DOJ? Jessica is looking at a decade, minimum. I stared out the window at the gray DC skyline. Emma deserves a life built on the truth, not blood money. The second piece was Judge Patricia Whitmore. I'd spent weeks vetting the judicial roster, looking for someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated by Richard's political connections. Whitmore was a legend, a former federal prosecutor who'd lost her brother to a wealthy criminal who walked on a technicality. She was the only person I trusted to see through the smoke and mirrors of a marketing firm CEO and a deadbeat mechanic. The third piece was the tactical strike. The FBI agreed to hit the courtroom at exactly 10:45 a.m. It was a surgical window. It gave Jessica and her high-priced lawyer, Hartwell, exactly 15 minutes to dig their own graves on the record before the handcuffs came out. Everything was set. My life was down to a single morning of theater. On June 17th, I woke up at 5 in the morning. My apartment silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I showered in the lukewarm water, shaved with a cheap disposable razor, and put on the uniform of a failure, the $12 Walmart button-down and scuffed Goodwill khakis. I looked at the man in the mirror and didn't see a mechanic or a broken husband. I saw a hunter. My phone buzzed on the counter, a single text from Harold. Green light. Assets in position. I took a deep breath, tasted the stale air of my studio one last time, and walked out the door. It was time to take my daughter back. The final chapter of this nightmare didn't start with a bang. It started with a long, hollow silence. The legal fallout, well, it wasn't exactly a sprint. It was a slow, grinding 18-month marathon that methodically dismantled everything Richard Crane had spent a lifetime building. Richard went first. And let me tell you, the federal prosecutors didn't just throw the book at him. They threw the entire library. The evidence was an absolute mountain. We're talking $127 million in documented illegal transactions, a digital paper trail of shell companies that spanned the globe, and a line of cooperating witnesses that literally stretched out the courtroom door. Even his team of high-priced, silver-tongued defense attorneys couldn't spin their way out of the math. The math I'd spent 3 years uncovering while living in a studio apartment that smelled like mildew and desperation. I was sitting in the back of the gallery, just my hands folded, when the jury foreman finally read the verdict. Convicted on 34 counts of money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The judge, a man who looked like he had zero patience for white-collar predators, handed down 23 years in federal prison. As the marshals led Richard away, he finally looked at me. The arrogance was completely gone. His expensive suit looked 3 sizes too big for him. And his eyes? They had that hollow, flickering look of a man who had finally run out of moves. A man who realized he was never as untouchable as he thought. Jessica's trial. Honestly, that was an entirely different kind of torture. It was harder to watch, not because I felt regret I didn't, but because the human cost was finally hitting the light. The prosecutors offered her a lifeline early on. Testify against Richard, plead guilty to reduce charges, and take a lighter sentence. She turned it down flat. She was still high on the delusion that Richard's connections would somehow swoop in and save them both. She bet on a ghost, and she lost. By the time she realized the cavalry wasn't coming, the best terms were already off the table. She ended up accepting a plea deal for conspiracy to commit fraud, theft of government funds, and obstruction of justice. The judge gave her 7 years. When I finally sat Emma down in our new, quiet living room to tell her, she didn't scream. She didn't throw things. She just cried these quiet, heavy tears, the kind that seemed to age her by 5 years in a single afternoon. It was the sound of a child finally realizing her mother wasn't the hero she'd been pretending to be. "Can I visit her?" she asked. Her voice was just a fragile thread. I pulled her into a hug, resting my chin on her head. "Of course, Emma. As often as you want." She pulled back, her eyes red-rimmed and searching mine. "Will she hate me for living with you instead of her parents?" I looked her straight in the eye. My voice was firm. "Your mother loves you, Emma. Whatever mistakes she made, that was never a lie. And she knows none of this was your fault." She whispered that it felt like it was, and I just held her tighter. "I know, baby, but feelings, they aren't always the truth." Life after the collapse. It was a strange, quiet transition back to real. Once the dust settled, I handed in my final resignation at Henderson's Auto Repair. Frank Henderson, a man who usually expressed emotion by just grunting, actually had tears in his eyes when I told him I was moving on. "Best damn mechanic I ever had," he said, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "Even if you were some kind of secret agent the whole time." I laughed and shook his hand, feeling the rough calluses I'd earned. "Just an investigator, Frank." And I wasn't lying about the work. There's something honest about fixing things you can actually see. FinCEN tried to roll out the red carpet for my return. They offered me a supervisory role and a massive raise to come back to the fold. The Crane case had made national headlines, and I was suddenly the agency's golden boy, but I turned them down. 3 years of breathing motor oil and living in the shadows? It had changed my DNA. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life in a cubicle, chasing digital ghosts and filing reports in triplicate. I wanted a life where I could actually see the sun. I used the back pay Harold had secretly kept funneled into a discretionary fund honestly. It was a small fortune I didn't even know existed to buy a modest 3-bedroom house. It's in a neighborhood where people actually know their neighbors' names. It has a big backyard, a garage where I still tinker with old engines on the weekend, and 0 glass walls. Emma transferred to the local public school that fall. She complained for about a week because it wasn't Riverside. But by October, she was the star of the soccer team and had a group of friends who didn't care what brand of shoes she wore. "It feels real here, Dad," she told me one night over a dinner of homemade tacos. I raised an eyebrow, curious. "Real how?" She shrugged, her expression thoughtful. "At Riverside, everyone was always performing, pretending to be rich, pretending to be happy, pretending to like each other. Here, if someone's a jerk, they just admit it. It's better." I smiled, realizing she'd learned the most important lesson of all before she'd even hit puberty. I eventually started consulting for the FBI and the DOJ, teaching new agents how to spot the invisible ink in financial crimes. The work is flexible. The pay is great. And most importantly, I'm home every single night for dinner. Harold Chen came over a year later, and we sat on the back porch with 2 cold beers, watching Emma kick a soccer ball across the grass. "You did something remarkable, Vince," he said, the condensation on his bottle glistening in the porch light. "Most people would have cracked after 6 months of playing the loser." I watched Emma score an imaginary goal. Her face lit up with a grin that made every oil stain and mildewed night worth it. "Most people don't have a daughter to protect, Harold." He nodded, but his eyes stayed on the yard. "It wasn't just that. You stayed because you knew Richard's connections would have buried a quick report. You wanted to make sure there was no escape." I took a sip of my beer. Maybe I was just being thorough. "How is Jessica?" he asked quietly. I looked at the soccer ball. "Surviving. She's taking accounting classes in the facility. She says she wants to understand what she was actually signing all those years." Harold asked if I believed her, and I just shrugged. I believe she wants to be better. Whether she actually changes, well, that's not up to me anymore. Emma came running over then, sweaty and beaming. "Dad, did you see that? Bend it like Beckham." I laughed, looking at Harold. "Who's Beckham?" "Man, I'm officially old." Later that night, after the house went quiet, I sat in the living room staring at a framed photo of Emma when she was 3 years old. She had no idea the world was going to explode. She had no idea her father would spend 3 years as a failure just to keep her safe. But we made it. I thought about all the people who laughed at my Walmart shirt and my 12-year-old car, and I realized they gave me the greatest gift of all. They stopped looking. See, people will always underestimate you. They'll look at your bank account, your clothes, or your job title, and think they've got you figured out. Let them. The truth doesn't care about designer suits or who you know in DC. It just waits, patient as stone, until the moment comes to reveal itself. I spent 3 years being a nobody, and honestly, I'd wear that $12 shirt every single day if it meant keeping the people I love safe. So, what would you sacrifice to protect the people you love? How far would you go to make sure the truth finally hit the light? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read every single one. And if you know someone who's being written off or told they aren't enough, share this with them. Sometimes, the people who look like they have nothing are the ones holding all the cards.